Have you ever wondered what it feels like to search for someone who vanished in the chaos of war, only to have the answer delivered by a creature that understands loyalty better than most humans ever could? Before we dive into this story, I need your help. First, comment below and tell me where you're from. This channel survives because of viewers like you who care about preserving these hidden chapters of history. Second, hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you content that most people will never hear about. Stories that have been buried in classified files and forgotten testimonies. Your subscription keeps this mission alive. The North African sun had turned the Tunisian desert into a furnace by mid-afternoon on April 19, 1943. Staff Sergeant William Eugene Hatcher from Biloxi, Mississippi, stood at the perimeter of what remained of Kasserine Pass, squinting through dust and heat shimmer at the horizon. The 2nd Armored Division had pushed through this corridor of death 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind the wreckage of one of America's most humiliating defeats in the war. Now, in the aftermath, they were tasked with something far more haunting than combat: finding the missing. 73 American soldiers had vanished during the German counteroffensive in February. Not killed, not captured, according to official records. Simply gone. Swallowed by the desert, by the confusion, by the fog of war that turned men into ghosts. The army needed answers. Families needed closure. But the desert kept its secrets, and 3 months of searching had yielded nothing but more questions and unmarked graves that belonged to someone else's son. Hatcher had been assigned to Recovery Unit 7, a designation that sounded official but was really just a polite way of saying grave detail. 6 men, 2 jeeps, and a map marked with red circles indicating probable search zones. They had been at it for 11 days, finding shell casings, abandoned equipment, and the occasional sun-bleached bone that might have been human or might have been from the livestock that once grazed these hills before the war turned everything into a killing field. It was Private James DeWitt Morrison from Athens, Georgia, who saw the dog first. He had been relieving himself behind a destroyed German half-track when movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a jackal. The desert was full of scavengers now, drawn by the banquet of death the armies had provided. But this creature moved differently. It had purpose. It was dragging something. Morrison called out, his voice cracking from dehydration and the shock of what he was seeing. The other men gathered quickly, weapons raised, because in this desert nothing moved without reason, and reason usually meant danger. But as they watched, the dog came closer, and they could see it was no wild animal. It wore a collar. Its fur, beneath the dust and grime, showed signs of having once been cared for. And between its jaws, gripped with the determination of a creature on a mission, was an American combat helmet. The dog was a mixed breed, perhaps shepherd, and something else, with eyes that held an intelligence that made several of the men uncomfortable. It did not bark. It did not growl. It simply walked toward them, step by deliberate step, dragging the helmet through the sand with a scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence. When it reached a point about 20 feet from where the soldiers stood frozen, the dog stopped. It released the helmet, sat back on its haunches, and waited. Sergeant Hatcher approached slowly, his hand extended in what he hoped was a gesture of peace. The dog did not move. It watched him with those unsettling eyes, and Hatcher had the distinct impression that he was being evaluated, judged by something that understood more than any animal should. He knelt beside the helmet, his knees sinking into sand that was still warm despite the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. The helmet was battered, scorched in places, with a dent above the left temple that suggested violent impact. But it was the weight of it, that made Hatcher's hands tremble as he lifted it. The helmet was too heavy. Something was inside. He turned it over, and his breath caught in his throat. Wrapped in what appeared to be strips of canvas, sealed with wax that had partially melted in the heat, was a package roughly the size of a hardcover book. Written on the canvas in faded ink were the words, "For whoever finds this, God have mercy on us all." And beneath that, a name, Lieutenant Marcus Isaiah Colton, 16th Infantry Regiment. Hatcher knew that name. Every man in Recovery Unit 7 knew that name. Lieutenant Colton had been the officer commanding the forward observation post at Kasserine Pass when the Germans launched their assault. He was one of the 73 missing. But more than that, he was the son of Brigadier General Raymond Colton, who had personally overseen the search efforts with the kind of desperate intensity that only a father could muster. Finding Lieutenant Colton, alive or dead, had become the obsessive focus of the entire recovery operation. The dog had brought them the first real lead in 3 months, but the question that made the hair on Hatcher's neck stand up was simple and terrifying. How did the dog know to bring this? How did it know where to find them? And what was inside the package that warranted such ominous warning? Private Morrison volunteered to unwrap it. His hands, steadier than Hatcher's, peeled away the wax seal and unwound the canvas strips. Inside was a journal, its leather cover stained dark with something that might have been blood or might have been desert mud. The pages were filled with handwriting that grew increasingly erratic toward the end, as if written by someone losing their grip on sanity or consciousness, or both. Hatcher opened to the first page and read aloud, his voice steady despite the growing sense of dread that settled over the men like a shroud. The journal began on February 14, 1943, the day before the German attack. Lieutenant Colton wrote, "We have been hearing sounds at night, not artillery, not vehicles, something else. The local interpreter, an old man named Hassan who refused to evacuate with the others, says the desert has memory. He says the ground here remembers every drop of blood spilled since the Carthaginians fought Rome. He says we should leave before we add our own blood to that memory. The men think he's superstitious. I think he might be right." The entries continued, documenting the initial German assault, the chaos, the retreat. But then, on February 17th, the tone changed. Colton wrote, "We are cut off. 12 of us made it to an old French Foreign Legion outpost about 3 miles southeast of our original position. The structure is partially collapsed, but it offers cover. We have ammunition and some rations. We should be able to hold out until relief arrives. But something is wrong with this place. There are marks on the walls, symbols carved into stone. Davis, who studied anthropology at Yale before the war, says they are not Arabic, not Berber, not any language he recognizes. They look ancient. They look like warnings." Over the next week, Colton's entries became increasingly disturbing. He described sounds in the night, footsteps that circled their position but never approached close enough to engage. He wrote of men seeing figures in the darkness, shapes that moved wrong, that defied the physics of shadow and light. 2 soldiers went missing on the night of February 21st. They were on watch together. No sounds of struggle, no signs of combat. They simply vanished from their posts, and in their place were small piles of sand arranged in perfect geometric patterns. By February 24th, only 6 men remained. Colton wrote, "We found Davis this morning, or what was left of him. He was buried up to his neck in sand about 200 yards from the outpost. His eyes were open. He was still breathing, but when we dug him out, he could not speak. He could only scream. We tried to bring him back, But he died an hour later, still screaming, clawing at his own throat, as if trying to remove something we could not see. Before he died, he managed to write one word in the sand: underneath. The journal continued, each entry shorter, more frantic. March 2nd. 3 of us left. The sounds are constant now. We can hear them digging. They are beneath us. March 4th. Sanders tried to run. He made it about 50 yards before the ground opened up. I watched him get pulled down, watched the sand close over his head like water. It took 12 seconds. I counted. March 6th. Just me and Corporal Reynolds now. We found the tunnel entrance. It was hidden beneath the old Legion barracks, stone stairs leading down. Reynolds wants to explore. He thinks there might be a way out. I know better. But what choice do we have? We cannot stay here. We cannot leave. We can only go down. The final entry was dated March 9th. The handwriting was barely legible, written by someone whose hand was shaking violently or who was writing in complete darkness, or both. It said, "We went down, found a chamber. Ancient, beyond ancient. The walls covered in those symbols. And in the center, a well. Not for water, for something else." Reynolds looked in, started laughing. Could not stop. I had to knock him unconscious to make it stop. When I looked in, I understood. This is where they feed. This is where they have always fed. The desert does not have memory. The desert is memory, and it is hungry. I am going to seal this journal and give it to the only one I can trust. If you are reading this, then I failed to make it out. Tell my father I tried. Tell him not to send anyone else. Tell him to leave this place to the sand and whatever lives beneath it. And tell him that I loved him, even at the end, even when I understood what was waiting for me. The journal ended there, but tucked between the last pages was a photograph, creased and faded. It showed a young German shepherd puppy sitting next to Lieutenant Colton, both of them smiling at the camera. On the back, in Colton's handwriting, Max, 3 months old, best scout in the battalion, December 1942. Sergeant Hatcher looked up from the journal at the dog sitting patiently in the sand, still watching them with those knowing eyes. The same dog from the photograph, but that had been taken 5 months ago, when the dog was a puppy. The animal before them was fully grown, mature, with scars across its muzzle that suggested it had seen combat, had survived things that would have killed a lesser creature. 5 months in the desert, without food or water or shelter. 5 months waiting. For what? For someone to give the helmet to? For someone who could understand? The dog had not eaten Colton's body, though it must have been starving. It had not abandoned its post, though survival instinct should have driven it to seek water, to seek other humans, to seek anything other than this desolate stretch of sand and death. Private Morrison was the one who asked the question they were all thinking. Where is Lieutenant Colton now? If the dog brought us the helmet, brought us the journal, where is the lieutenant? Where is his body? The dog had carried the helmet for miles, judging by its condition, by the wear patterns on the straps. But from where? The dog stood, turned, and began walking back the way it had come. After about 10 paces, it stopped and looked back at them, head tilted, waiting. The message was clear. Follow me. Hatcher radioed back to the main recovery unit, requesting immediate backup and medical support. Something in his voice must have conveyed the urgency of the situation because the response was swift. They were told to proceed with caution and that reinforcements would arrive within the hour. But an hour felt like an eternity as they gathered their gear and prepared to follow a dog into the desert toward something that Lieutenant Colton's journal had warned them to avoid. They moved out at 1600 hours, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that looked disturbingly like blood. The dog maintained a steady pace, never rushing, never slowing, leading them southeast across terrain that grew increasingly rough. They passed through a graveyard of destroyed vehicles, German and American mixed together in the democratic carnage of war. They passed through a dried riverbed where the sand was darker, stained with something other than water. After 47 minutes of walking, the dog stopped at the base of a low hill that rose from the desert floor like a tumor. The structure was there, half buried, barely visible above the shifting sands. The old French Foreign Legion outpost, exactly as Colton had described it. But it was not the outpost that made the men stop in their tracks, weapons raised, hearts pounding. It was what surrounded it. Arranged in a perfect circle around the outpost, spaced exactly 3 feet apart, were helmets. American helmets. 73 of them, each one sitting upright in the sand, each one facing inward toward the structure. Inside each helmet was sand, piled high, formed into small mounds that rose above the rim. And on top of each mound was a set of dog tags. Hatcher approached the nearest helmet with the kind of dread that comes from knowing you are about to confirm your worst fears. He picked up the dog tags, his hands shaking so badly he could barely read the stamped letters. Private First Class Robert Andrew Chen, Service Number 3618-2947, Blood Type O positive. He was on the list of the missing. Morrison checked another helmet. Corporal Thomas Jefferson Williams, also on the list. They moved from helmet to helmet, and each one contained the identification of a missing soldier from Kasserine Pass. 73 men accounted for, their final resting places marked by their own helmets, filled with desert sand, guarded by a dog that should not have survived. But where were the bodies? Where was Lieutenant Colton? And who had arranged the helmets in this perfect circle? The Germans would not have bothered. The locals had evacuated long before the battle. That left only one possibility, one explanation that made the rational part of Hatcher's mind rebel, even as the evidence before him made it undeniable. The dog sat in the center of the circle, at the entrance to the outpost, and waited. The reinforcements had not yet arrived. The sun was sinking faster now, and shadows were growing long. They had perhaps 30 minutes of good light left. Hatcher knew they should wait for backup, should establish a perimeter, should follow protocol. But he also knew that some questions could not wait. Some answers demanded to be found, regardless of the cost. He approached the outpost entrance, his flashlight held steady in one hand, his sidearm in the other. The dog moved aside, pressing itself against the ancient stone wall as if giving him room to pass. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to fit through, and it opened onto a descending staircase carved from rock that predated the Foreign Legion by centuries, possibly millennia. The stairs led down into darkness that his flashlight could barely penetrate. The beam seemed to die after about 20 feet, swallowed by a blackness that felt almost solid. The air that rose from below was cold, impossibly cold for a desert afternoon, and it carried with it a smell that Hatcher could not identify. Not decay, not exactly. Something older, something that reminded him of the smell of earth after heavy rain. Except there had been no rain here in months. He descended one step at a time, his boots echoing in the confined space. Behind him, he could hear Morrison and the others entering, could feel their presence in the darkness. But he could also feel something else, a pressure, a weight, as if the air itself was pushing back against their intrusion. trying to force them back up the stairs, back into the light, back to safety. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel widened into a chamber. Hatcher's flashlight beam swept across walls covered in the symbols Colton had described. They were carved deep into the stone, each one unique, each one somehow unsettling in a way that defied explanation. They did not look random. They looked like language, like writing, like the desperate attempt of something to communicate across a barrier of time and understanding. In the center of the chamber was the well. It was circular, about 6 feet in diameter, ringed with stones that had been polished smooth by hands that had touched them thousands of years ago. The well had no rope, no bucket, no practical purpose for drawing water. It was simply a hole in the ground, dropping down into more darkness, into depths that Hatcher's flashlight could not reach. But it was not empty. As Hatcher approached, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he could see that the well was filled almost to the rim with sand. Dry, fine sand that shifted and moved with a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind or gravity. The sand was breathing, or something beneath the sand was breathing. And then he saw them. Partially visible, protruding from the sand at various angles, were the remains of the missing soldiers. Not complete bodies, just fragments. A hand here, reaching upward, as if grasping for help that would never come. A section of rib cage there, the bones bleached white and polished smooth. A skull, half buried, its jaw hanging open in a silent scream that would echo through eternity. Hatcher felt his legs weaken, his vision blur at the edges. This was not a grave. This was not a burial site. This was something else entirely. Something that defied every concept of death and rest that his mind could process. The bodies had not been placed here with care or ceremony. They had been consumed, pulled down into the sand grain by grain, absorbed into whatever waited below. And somehow, impossibly, the process was not complete. The bones still moved. The sand still breathed. The feeding had never stopped. Morrison vomited behind him, the sound echoing obscenely in the chamber. The other men stood frozen, their flashlights creating overlapping circles of light that danced across the well's surface like searchlights trying to find something that could not be seen, only felt. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Their breath came out in visible clouds, impossible in the desert heat, impossible in any rational world. The dog had followed them down. It stood at the edge of the chamber, perfectly still, watching the well with the kind of attention that soldiers gave to enemy positions before an assault. Its lips pulled back slightly, not in aggression, but in something that looked disturbingly like anticipation or recognition, as if it had been here before, as if it knew what was coming next. Hatcher forced himself to move closer to the well, his training overriding the primal instinct that screamed at him to run. He needed to document this. He needed evidence. Whatever horror had claimed these men, their families deserved to know. General Colton deserved to know what had happened to his son. The flashlight beam swept across the sand, and that was when he saw it. A hand, newer than the others, less decayed, still wearing a West Point-class ring. The ring bore the inscription, Class of 1941, the year Lieutenant Marcus Colton had graduated. The hand was not reaching upward like the others. It was palm down, fingers spread, pressed against something beneath the sand as if trying to hold a door closed, or trying to keep something from coming up. And around the wrist, tied with a strip of cloth that might have once been part of a uniform, was a leash. The other end of the leash disappeared into the sand, but Hatcher knew with absolute certainty where it led. To the collar of the dog that now sat behind him, watching, waiting, guarding. Private Morrison found his voice, though it came out as a broken whisper. "Sergeant, we need to leave. Right now. We need to get out of here and collapse this entire structure. Seal it. Bury it. Pretend we never found it." But Hatcher could not move. Something compelled him to understand, to piece together the final moments of Lieutenant Colton's life and death. The journal had said he went down into this chamber with Corporal Reynolds. The journal had said Reynolds looked into the well and started laughing. The journal had ended with Colton sealing it and giving it to the only one he could trust. The dog, Max. The German shepherd that should have been dead months ago but instead had survived to deliver the message. Hatcher aimed his flashlight at the walls again, studying the symbols more carefully. They were not random. They were not decorative. They told a story, a warning carved by people who had discovered this place long before the French Foreign Legion, long before the Carthaginians, long before recorded history. The symbols showed figures descending into the earth. They showed the earth opening up like a mouth. They showed the figures being consumed, but not dying. Never dying. Just feeding the hunger that had existed since the desert was born. And then, carved larger than the others, more recent, done with a bayonet or knife blade rather than ancient tools, were words in English. Lieutenant Colton's final message, written directly into the stone before he made his choice. The words read, "The well is a throat. It swallows but never digests. We are still here, all of us, aware, trapped. Do not let them send anyone else. The desert takes everything. Give Max to my father. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him to burn this place and never speak of it again." A sound emerged from the well, not loud, not threatening. Just a whisper, like wind moving through a narrow canyon, except there was no wind down here, no air movement at all. The whisper resolved into something that might have been words, might have been human voices, might have been the sound of 73 men trying to scream through mouths filled with sand. The sound grew, not in volume, but in complexity, in layers, until it seemed like the entire chamber was filled with the murmur of desperate conversation, of prayers, of pleading. The sand in the well began to move with purpose now, swirling, creating patterns that looked like faces pressing up from below, trying to break through to the surface, trying to breathe air that had been denied them for months. Hatcher saw a shape that looked like Corporal Reynolds, mouth open in that endless laugh that Colton had described. He saw shapes that might have been Private Chen, Corporal Williams, all the names on the dog tags arranged in the circle above. And he saw, just for a moment, rising higher than the others, the face of Lieutenant Marcus Isaiah Colton, his eyes open, looking directly at Hatcher with an expression of such profound despair that it transcended death itself. The radio on Hatcher's belt crackled to life, making all of them jump. The voice of Captain Edmund Foster from the recovery unit came through, distorted by static and distance. "Hatcher, we're approaching your position. We have General Colton with us. He insisted on coming. We'll be there in 5 minutes. What's your status?" General Colton was coming. The father who had spent 3 months searching for his son was about to arrive at the place where that son had died, where he might still be dying, forever dying, caught in a state between life and death that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. Hatcher had to make a decision. Tell the truth and let the general see what his son had become? Or lie, say they found nothing, lead everyone away and seal this chamber with demolition charges, erasing the evidence and the horror along with it. Before he could respond, the dog moved. It walked past Hatcher, past the horrified soldiers, directly to the edge of the well. It sat down, facing the sand, and began to do something that made every rational thought in Hatcher's mind collapse into chaos. The dog began to dig, its paws moving with mechanical precision, sending sand flying behind it in perfect arcs. But it was not digging down. It was digging up, pulling more sand out of the well, piling it onto the chamber floor. And as it dug, things came up with the sand. Personal effects, identification tags, watches, wedding rings, photographs, letters from home, all the small treasures that soldiers carried with them into battle, the tokens of lives they had left behind and hoped to return to. The dog arranged them carefully, separating each item, creating neat piles organized by owner. It worked with the kind of methodical intelligence that went far beyond animal instinct. Morrison grabbed Hatcher's arm, his grip painful. That dog is not natural. That thing is not a dog. We need to shoot it and get out of here. But Hatcher shook off the grip. The dog was not the enemy. The dog was the messenger, the guardian, the last loyal soldier following orders from a commander who could no longer give them. Max had stayed at his post for 3 months, had protected the site, had arranged the helmets in their ceremonial circle, had waited for someone to come who could understand, who could make the choice that Colton himself could no longer make. Hatcher keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Captain Foster, I need you to stop General Colton from approaching this position. Tell him we found evidence of his son's final location, but that he cannot, under any circumstances, come down here. Tell him it's classified. Tell him it's a biohazard. Tell him whatever you need to tell him, but keep him away." There was a long pause. Then Foster's voice came back, confused and slightly irritated. "Hatcher, I can't order a general to do anything. What the hell is going on down there?" Hatcher looked at the well, at the faces still pressing up through the sand, at the dog that had stopped digging and now sat watching him with those knowing eyes. He looked at the pile of personal effects, each one representing a man who had a mother, a father, a wife, a child waiting for news that would break their hearts. And he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Tell the general we found his son's body. Tell him Lieutenant Colton died with honor, defending his position against enemy forces. Tell him we will return the body for proper burial with full military honors. And tell him that his son's final message was that he loved him. The lie came easily, far more easily than the truth ever could. Because the truth would destroy General Colton. The truth would destroy the families of 73 soldiers. The truth would open questions that the military could never answer, would lead to investigations that would uncover horrors that went beyond this one chamber, this one desert, this one war. And Hatcher understood, with the kind of clarity that comes in moments of absolute crisis, that some truths were more dangerous than any lie. Morrison spoke, his voice hoarse. "But Sergeant, there is no body. There's just that." He gestured at the well, at the sand, at the nightmare that defied classification. Hatcher turned to his men. Private Morrison, Corporal Daniel Hutchison, Private First Class Lawrence Bennett, Specialist Gregory Vaughn. 4 men who would have to carry this secret. 4 men who would have to look families in the eye and lie about how their sons and husbands and fathers had died. 4 men who would have to live with the knowledge of what was really down here, waiting, feeding, never satisfied. "We're going to create a body," Hatcher said quietly. "We're going to take Lieutenant Colton's uniform, his identification, his personal effects that the dog recovered. We're going to put them in a sealed casket and tell everyone that the body was too damaged by the elements to allow viewing. We're going to give General Colton something to bury, something to mourn over, something that will let him sleep at night. And then we're going to seal this chamber with enough explosives to bring down the entire outpost. Bennett, the youngest of the group, barely 20 years old, shook his head. But that's desertion of duty. That's falsifying military records. That's mercy, Hatcher interrupted. That's the only kindness we can give these men. We cannot save them. We cannot free them. All we can do is make sure no one else joins them in this place. The dog had finished arranging the personal effects. It stood, walked to Hatcher, and dropped something at his feet. Lieutenant Colton's West Point ring, still attached to the finger bone. The message was clear. Take what is needed to create the illusion. Do what must be done, and then destroy this place. They worked quickly, gathering everything that bore Colton's name or image. The ring, a pocket watch, a handful of letters, a photograph of his family, his identification tags. They packed it all carefully in a salvage bag, creating the foundation of the lie that would become official history. And while they worked, the whispers from the well grew louder, more urgent, as if the trapped soldiers understood what was happening, as if they were trying to convey some final message that would never be heard. The reinforcements arrived topside just as Hatcher and his team emerged from the chamber. General Raymond Colton was there, a man in his early 50s who had aged a decade in 3 months of searching. His face was carved with lines of grief and exhaustion, his eyes hollow with the kind of pain that only a parent can know. He looked at Hatcher, at the salvage bag, and Hatcher watched something in the general break and reform simultaneously. "You found him," General Colton said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered by a man who had known, on some level, that his son was dead, but had refused to accept it, until presented with undeniable proof. "Yes, sir," Hatcher replied, and he told the lie with such conviction that he almost believed it himself. Lieutenant Colton was killed in action, defending his position. He fought with honor. His final thoughts were of you and his family. He wanted you to know he loved you. General Colton took the salvage bag with hands that shook. He did not open it. He did not inspect the contents. He simply held it against his chest and nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sergeant. Thank you for bringing my boy home." After the general left, after the official statements were filed, after the ceremony was planned for full military honors, Hatcher returned to the outpost with a demolitions team. They planted charges in the chamber, in the tunnels, in the foundation of the structure itself. Enough explosives to collapse everything, to bury the well under tons of rock and sand, to seal it so completely that no one would ever find it again. The dog, Max, watched from a distance as they worked. It had not left the site. It had not tried to follow the general or escape to safety. It remained, as if understanding that its duty was not yet complete. When everything was ready, when the charges were set, and the timers were armed, Hatcher approached the dog one final time. "Come with us," he said, extending his hand. "Your job is done. You kept your promise. You protected him. Now you can rest." The dog looked at him with those intelligent eyes, and Hatcher could have sworn he saw something in that gaze. Understanding, gratitude, but also determination. The dog turned away, walked back toward the outpost entrance, and descended the stairs one final time, going back to the chamber, going back to stand guard over men who could not die and could not be saved. Hatcher wanted to follow, wanted to drag the animal to safety, but Captain Foster grabbed his arm, Let it go, Sergeant. Some loyalties run deeper than survival. If that's where it wants to be, that's where it should be. They detonated the charges from 200 yards away. The explosion was massive, consuming, sending a pillar of dust and debris 300 feet into the desert sky. The outpost collapsed in on itself, creating a crater where it had stood. The sound echoed across the desert for miles, a final punctuation mark on a story that would never be told. The official report stated that Recovery Unit 7 had located the remains of Lieutenant Marcus Isaiah Colton and 72 other missing soldiers from the Kasserine Pass engagement. The remains were recovered and returned to their families for proper burial. The search was concluded. The case was closed. The war moved on, leaving behind its dead and its secrets in equal measure. But 3 days after the demolition, strange reports began filtering in from other units operating in the area. Soldiers on patrol reported seeing a dog in the desert, always at a distance, always watching. A German shepherd with scars on its muzzle, wearing a collar that bore American military tags. The dog never approached. It never threatened. It simply followed at a distance, as if guarding something, as if waiting for something. And then the sounds started. Units camped within 5 miles of the demolished outpost reported hearing voices at night. Whispers in the darkness. The sound of men calling for help in languages they could not identify. The sound of digging beneath their tents. Several soldiers requested transfers. 2 went AWOL and were never found. The area was eventually designated as off-limits, though no official explanation was ever provided. Sergeant Hatcher survived the war. He returned to Mississippi, married, had children, lived what appeared to be a normal life. But those who knew him well said he was never quite the same after Tunisia. He refused to talk about what he had seen there. He developed a severe aversion to sand, to deserts, to any place where the ground was soft and dry and deep. In his later years, he was known to wake screaming in the night, shouting warnings about the well, about the feeding, about the men who could not die. Before he passed away in 1998 at the age of 77, Hatcher granted one final interview to a military historian researching the North African campaign. The interview was sealed for 50 years at Hatcher's request, but portions were leaked to researchers in 2013. In the interview, Hatcher spoke about Tunisia, about the chamber, about the dog, about the lie he told General Colton, and he revealed something that had never appeared in any official report. In the weeks following the demolition of the outpost, other recovery units across North Africa began finding similar sites. Chambers beneath the sand, wells filled with the remains of soldiers, symbols carved into ancient stone. The pattern repeated itself in Libya, in Egypt, in Algeria. Dozens of sites, perhaps hundreds, each one marked by the same signs, the same warnings carved by civilizations that had risen and fallen long before modern man thought to make war in the desert. The military quietly investigated, quietly sealed each location, quietly suppressed the information, because to acknowledge it would be to acknowledge something far more terrifying than enemy forces or military defeat. It would be to acknowledge that the desert itself was hostile, that it had been hostile for millennia, that every army that had ever marched across its surface had paid a toll that went beyond casualties and equipment loss, a toll measured in souls trapped between states of existence, feeding something ancient, something patient, something that would outlast every empire that ever thought to claim the sand as their own. Hatcher's final words in the interview were these: "I see that dog sometimes, even now, 50 years later. I'll be walking down the street or sitting in my backyard, and I'll catch a glimpse of something at the edge of my vision. A German shepherd with scars on its muzzle, watching me, making sure I keep the secret, making sure I never tell the full truth, because the full truth would destroy too many people. It would shatter the illusion that we understand war, that we control it, that we can win it. The truth is that we are just visitors in that desert. We always have been. And the desert never forgets. It never stops feeding. And it never stops waiting for more. The interview concluded with Hatcher making a statement that the military historian found inexplicable at the time. He said, "If you're listening to this, if you're learning about what happened in Tunisia, I need you to understand something. The demolition did not stop it. The charges we planted, the tons of rock we buried it under, none of that mattered. Because you cannot kill something that was never alive. You cannot destroy something that exists as a function of the desert itself. The most we did was delay it, hide it, buy time for the men who came after us. But it's still there. It's still feeding. And one day, someone is going to dig in the wrong place, or drill for oil in the wrong location, or build a base over the wrong patch of sand, and they're going to find it again. And when they do, they're going to learn what Lieutenant Colton learned, what I learned, what every soldier who has ever disappeared in the desert eventually learns. That some places are not meant for the living. That some ground is sacred in the worst possible way. And that loyalty, true loyalty, extends beyond death, beyond reason, beyond hope. General Raymond Colton died in 1967, believing his son had died a hero's death. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full honors. At his funeral, witnesses reported seeing a dog sitting at a distance from the mourners, watching the ceremony with the kind of attention that suggested understanding. When approached, the dog retreated into the trees and was not seen again. Cemetery staff later reported finding a small circle of sand arranged around General Colton's grave marker, though there was no sand anywhere else in the cemetery, and no explanation for how it had gotten there. Lieutenant Marcus Isaiah Colton's name appears on the World War II memorial in Washington, D.C., listed among the honored dead. His official records state he was killed in action on February 17, 1943, in Tunisia, during the Kasserine Pass engagement. The records make no mention of chambers or wells or dogs, or the 3 weeks he spent trapped in a state worse than death. History remembers him as a hero. Only 4 men knew the truth, and 3 of them took that truth to their graves. The 4th, Corporal Daniel Hutchison, is still alive as of this recording. He is 96 years old, living in a care facility in Virginia. He has agreed to break his silence, to speak about what he saw in Tunisia, on the condition that his testimony be used to warn others. He says the military continues to operate in the region, continues to build bases and conduct exercises in areas that should remain untouched. He says he hears reports of soldiers going missing, of patrols that vanish without explanation, of sounds in the night that command tries to blame on wind or wildlife or enemy activity. And he says he dreams of the dog every night, still guarding the well, still protecting the men who cannot die, still waiting for the day when the sand finally consumes everything and everyone, when the desert reclaims what was always rightfully its own. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether this story is true. The question is whether we have the courage to believe it could be, whether we can accept that our understanding of war, of death, of reality itself might be incomplete, whether we can face the possibility that beneath the surface of the world we think we know, there are depths we were never meant to explore. In times like these, when the world seems filled with darkness, when the weight of history presses down on us, we must remember to turn to something greater than ourselves. To turn to God, to turn to Jesus Christ, who offers light in the deepest darkness, who offers hope when all seems lost. Whatever horrors exist in this world, whatever unexplainable terrors lurk beneath the surface, faith provides an anchor, a foundation that cannot be shaken by fear or doubt. If this story teaches us anything, it is that loyalty matters, that sacrifice matters, and that there are forces in this universe that transcend our understanding. In the face of such forces, faith is not weakness. It is survival. The footage of this story has been compiled from declassified military records, sealed interviews, and first-hand testimony. But many questions remain unanswered. The exact location of the demolished outpost has never been publicly disclosed. The official casualty reports for Kasserine Pass match the numbers mentioned here, but the circumstances of death remain classified for national security reasons, and reports of a German Shepherd appearing near military installations in North Africa continue to surface, though each one is dismissed as folklore or misidentification. Perhaps it does not matter whether every detail is accurate. Perhaps what matters is the warning itself, that some places should remain undisturbed, that some sacrifices are so complete that they echo across time, that some loyalties never die, no matter how many years pass, no matter how deep you bury the evidence. The desert keeps its secrets. But sometimes, when the wind is right, when the sand shifts in just the right way, those secrets find their way to the surface, and when they do, they are carried not by human hands, but by the faithful guardian who refused to abandon his post, who refused to let the story disappear completely, who understood that some truths must be told, even if they can never be fully believed. The helmet is real. The journal is real. The 73 soldiers are real. What happened to them beneath that desert remains a question that no official report will ever answer. But the next time you hear a story about soldiers disappearing in the desert, about ancient sites discovered beneath the sand, about dogs that refuse to leave battlefields long after the fighting has ended, remember Lieutenant Marcus Isaiah Colton and ask yourself, what would I do if I had to choose between truth and mercy? Between history and horror? Between the comfort of lies and the terror of reality? And if you ever find yourself in the desert, in the quiet hours when the sun has set and the darkness seems absolute, listen carefully. You might hear the whispers. You might see the shape watching from a distance. You might find yourself standing at the edge of something far older and far hungrier than any human war. And in that moment, you will understand what Sergeant Hatcher understood, what Lieutenant Colton understood, what the dog has always understood, that the desert remembers everything, and it never stops waiting for more.